The morning light came through the silver trees of Valdris like threads of gold, and Lunara opened her eyes to the sound of her 3 dragon cubs playing outside the cave entrance, and she smiled because this was her favorite way to wake up after so many years of traveling alone through the dangerous parts of the galaxy. She stretched her arms above her head and walked to the mouth of the cave, where Ember, the smallest cub, was trying to breathe fire at a floating leaf, while Frost and Shadow wrestled each other in the soft grass, and all 3 of them had grown so much in the past 2 months that Lunara could hardly believe they had once fit in her traveling pack. The forest moon had become their home after Lunara found the eggs abandoned in a crashed ship near the outer rim, and no mother dragon had come for them, so she took them with her and raised them as her own children. And now she could not imagine life without their happy chirping sounds and the way they curled up against her at night for warmth. She checked the food supplies in the cave and saw they were running low on the dried meat she had stored, so she would need to go hunting today and hopefully find some of the large deer creatures that lived near the northern stream, because the cubs ate more each day, and soon they would need even bigger meals. Lunara pulled on her leather hunting boots and tied her long silver hair back with a cord made from tree bark, and then she strapped her bow and quiver across her shoulder and called to the cubs that she would be back before the sun reached the top of the sky. Ember ran over to her and rubbed against her leg, making that purring sound that meant she wanted attention, and Lunara scratched behind the little dragon ears and promised to bring back something special for dinner. And Ember seemed satisfied with that and went back to practicing her fire breathing. The forest was quiet as Lunara moved through the trees with the practiced silence of someone who had spent 300 years learning to hunt and track, and she knew every path and stream on this moon now, and had marked the best places to find game and fresh water and healing plants. She reached the northern stream after walking for about an hour and knelt down to examine the tracks in the mud near the water edge, and saw fresh prints from several deer creatures, and they were heading west toward the berry groves, which meant she could set up an ambush point near the grove entrance. But as she stood up, she heard something that did not belong in this peaceful forest, and it was a mechanical humming sound like the engines of a small ship. And Lunara felt her stomach tighten because she had chosen this moon specifically because almost no one came here, and she wanted her cubs to grow up away from the dangers of civilized space. She moved toward the sound, carefully staying hidden behind the thick tree trunks, and after a few minutes she saw a human landing craft sitting in a clearing about half a mile from her cave, and the ramp was down, and she could see 2 figures moving around outside wearing the kind of gear that scientists or researchers used. Lunara had met humans before during her travels, and most of them had been decent enough people, but she also knew they had a reputation for being curious about things they should leave alone, and for taking creatures back to their labs for study. And she felt a cold fear run through her chest because her cubs were powerful predators, and some humans would pay a fortune to own a dragon. She watched the humans for several minutes and saw them setting up equipment that looked like sensors or cameras, and they seemed to be scanning the forest and taking samples from plants and soil. And one of them was a woman with dark skin who kept talking into a recording device about ecosystem balance and native species. The other was a man with light brown hair who was checking readings on a handheld scanner, and he looked excited about something he found and called the woman over to show her, and they both seemed focused on their scientific work and not on hunting for dangerous animals. Lunara decided they were probably harmless researchers who would finish their work and leave within a few days, and she would just keep the cubs close to the cave and avoid this area until the humans were gone, and everything would be fine. She turned to head back home and continue her hunting in a different direction, but then she heard something that made her blood turn to ice, and it was Ember's voice crying out in pain and fear from somewhere in the forest between her position and the cave. Lunara ran faster than she had ever run in her life, crashing through bushes and jumping over fallen logs, and her heart pounded in her chest because that cry had been real pain, not just a cub throwing a tantrum, and she could hear Frost and Shadow making distress calls too, which meant something was very wrong. She burst into a small clearing and saw Ember lying on the ground with her front leg caught in a metal trap, and blood was running from the wound where the sharp teeth of the trap had bitten into her scales, and the little dragon was crying and pulling, trying to free herself while Frost and Shadow circled around her, making frightened noises. Lunara dropped to her knees beside Ember and examined the trap and felt rage building inside her. because this was a poacher trap designed to catch valuable animals alive, and someone had set these up in her forest to steal creatures and sell them. And now her baby was hurt because of their greed. She carefully pried the trap open and lifted Ember's leg free, and the cub immediately crawled into her lap, whimpering, and Lunara could see the wound was bad with deep cuts that would need cleaning and bandaging and possibly medicine to prevent infection. The problem was she did not have the right supplies back at the cave because she had never expected something like this to happen, and the nearest elf settlement with a healer was 3 days' travel away, and Ember might not have 3 days if the wound got infected. Frost and Shadow pressed against her sides, looking up at her with worried eyes, and Lunara held all 3 cubs close and tried to think clearly despite the panic rising in her throat, because she needed to make a decision fast and she was running out of options. Then she remembered the humans with their equipment and their scientific gear, and humans were known for having advanced medical technology even in their field kits, and she hated the idea of going to them for help. But her pride was worth nothing compared to Ember's life. She picked up Ember as gently as she could and told Frost and Shadow to follow close, and they began walking toward the clearing where the human ship was landed. And Lunara prayed to the old forest gods that these particular humans would be the helping kind, and not the capturing kind. Lunara walked slowly through the forest carrying Ember in her arms, while Frost and Shadow followed close behind, making worried chirping sounds, and the little injured dragon had stopped crying, but she was shaking, and Lunara could feel how hot her scales were getting, which meant fever was already starting. Every step felt heavy because she was walking toward strangers who might help or might make everything worse, and she had survived 300 years by trusting her instincts and avoiding unnecessary risks, but right now she had no choice because Ember's life depended on getting help fast. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped behind a large tree and watched the human ship for a few minutes, and she could see the woman with dark skin was now inside the craft working at a computer console, while the man with brown hair was still outside collecting plant samples. Lunara took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the tree and walked toward the ship, with Ember held carefully against her chest, and Frost and Shadow stayed right beside her, ready to defend their sister if needed. The man looked up from his plants and saw her coming, and his eyes went very wide, and he dropped his sample container and stumbled backward and called out something in human language that sounded like a warning to his partner. The woman came running down the ramp of the ship and stopped when she saw Lunara and the dragons, and her hand moved toward something on her belt. But then she saw the blood on Ember's leg, and her expression changed from fear to concern. Lunara stopped about 10 feet away from them and said in the common trade language that most space travelers knew that her cub was hurt and needed medical help, and she was willing to trade or pay if they had supplies. The woman stared at her for a moment and then responded in the same language with a thick accent asking what had happened, and Lunara explained about the poacher trap and showed her the wound on Ember's leg. The woman whose name tag said Nina looked at the man whose tag said Kyle, and they had a quick conversation in their own language, and Lunara caught a few words that sounded like debate about whether this was safe or allowed, but then Nina said something firm and final, and Kyle nodded. Nina turned back to Lunara and said they would help, and asked her to bring the injured cub up into the ship where they had a medical station, and Lunara hesitated because getting on a human ship with her cubs felt like walking into a trap. But Ember whimpered in her arms, and that made the decision easy. She walked up the ramp with Frost and Shadow following and found herself in a clean, bright space filled with scientific equipment and computer screens, and everything looked expensive and well-maintained, which meant these humans probably worked for a legitimate research organization. Nina led her to a table with medical supplies and scanning equipment and gestured for Lunara to set Ember down, and the little dragon cried out when she was moved. But then Nina started making soft, calming sounds and gently touched Ember's head with one hand while reaching for a scanner with the other. Lunara watched carefully as Nina ran the scanner over Ember's leg and studied the readings on a screen, and Kyle came up beside them and looked at the data and said something that sounded worried, and Nina nodded and started pulling out bandages and bottles of medicine. Nina looked at Lunara and explained in trade language that the wound was deep and already showing signs of infection, but they had antibiotics that should work, and they would need to clean the wound and stitch it closed and set the bone, because it had a small fracture from the trap pressure. She asked if Lunara would hold Ember still because they did not want to use sedatives without knowing more about dragon biology, and Lunara agreed and wrapped her arms around the cub while Nina and Kyle began working. Ember cried and tried to pull away when they cleaned the wound with antiseptic, but Lunara held her firm and whispered soothing words in the old elf tongue, and told her to be brave, and that the pain would pass soon. And Frost and Shadow pressed against Lunara's legs, offering comfort. Nina worked with steady hands, cleaning away dirt and dried blood from the wound, and then she used a small device that stitched the cuts closed with what looked like surgical thread, and Kyle held a light so she could see clearly, and both humans were completely focused on helping the injured cub. After the stitches, Nina carefully wrapped Ember's leg in a white bandage, and then gave her an injection of antibiotics, and showed Lunara the medicine bottle and explained through words and gestures how much to give and how often. The whole process took almost an hour, and by the end Ember had stopped crying and was just lying quietly on the table, looking exhausted, and Lunara felt tears in her eyes because these strangers had been so gentle and careful with her. Baby Kyle brought over a soft thermal blanket and helped Nina wrap Ember in it, and then he surprised Lunara by pulling out some dried meat from a storage container and offering small pieces to Frost and Shadow, who sniffed it carefully before eating. Nina sat back and wiped sweat from her forehead and told Lunara that Ember would need to rest for at least 3 weeks and should not try to fly or run during that time, and the wound needed to stay clean and dry, and she should come back if there were any signs of infection, like increased fever or swelling. Lunara asked what she owed them for the treatment and reached for the small pouch at her belt where she kept trade gems and coins, but Nina shook her head and said they did not want payment because helping injured animals was part of their job as researchers. Kyle added that they were actually glad Lunara had come to them because they had been worried about those traps and asked if she knew how many were set up in the forest, and Lunara admitted she had never seen them before today because she usually avoided this section. Nina looked angry when she heard that and said poachers were a problem all over this sector, and they trapped rare creatures to sell to private collectors, and it was illegal, but hard to stop. And she asked if Lunara would be willing to show them where she found the trap that hurt. Ember Lunara agreed because she wanted those traps gone, and the 4 of them left the ship with Lunara carrying Ember, who was now sleeping peacefully. And they walked back to the clearing where the trap had been. Kyle examined the trap carefully and took pictures with a device. And Nina used her scanner to search the surrounding area, and she found 2 more traps hidden under leaves and branches, and both of them looked at each other with serious expressions. Nina told Lunara they were going to spend the rest of their research mission clearing these traps and reporting the poacher activity to the sector patrol, and Kyle added that they would set up monitoring equipment to catch anyone who came back to check the traps. Lunara felt something warm spread through her chest because these humans could have ignored the problem or just treated Ember and sent them away, but instead they were choosing to help protect the forest and its creatures. She thanked them in both trade language and in her own elf tongue. And Nina smiled and said they should exchange communication codes in case Lunara ever needed help again, or if she spotted more suspicious activity in the forest. As the sun began to set, Lunara walked back toward her cave with her 3 cubs, and she looked back once to see Nina and Kyle already working to disable the traps they had found, and she thought that maybe not all the stories about humans being dangerous were completely true. 5 days passed since the trap incident, and Ember was healing well thanks to the medicine Nina had provided, and Lunara changed the bandage every morning, just like the human woman had shown her, and the wound looked clean with no signs of infection. The little dragon was frustrated about not being allowed to run or fly, and she spent most of her time lying in the sun near the cave entrance, while Frost and Shadow brought her interesting rocks and leaves to keep her entertained, and Lunara felt grateful that her cubs took care of each other. On the 6th morning, Lunara woke up to the sound of her communication device beeping, and she grabbed it from the shelf where she kept her supplies and saw a message from Nina asking if she could visit the cave to check on Ember's progress. Lunara sent back a message saying yes and gave directions to her home. And then she spent the next hour tidying up the cave and making sure the cubs were fed and clean because she wanted to show the humans that she was taking good care of Ember. Nina and Kyle arrived around midday carrying packs full of equipment, and they greeted Lunara with friendly waves, and Nina immediately went to examine Ember while Kyle set up a portable scanner. Nina looked very pleased when she saw how well the wound was healing, and she told Lunara she had done an excellent job with the bandage changes and medicine schedule, and Ember would probably be able to start walking short distances in another week. Kyle ran his scanner over all 3 cubs and explained that he was collecting data on their growth rates and vital signs for his research on native species, and he promised all the information would be kept confidential and would help protect dragons if anyone tried to claim they were dangerous predators that needed to be controlled after the examination. Nina pulled out a container from her pack and opened it to reveal fresh meat that was still cold from their ship's cooling unit, and she explained that she had brought extra protein for the cubs since they were growing so fast and needed lots of food. Frost and Shadow got excited when they smelled the meat and started chirping loudly, and even Ember perked up and tried to stand before Lunara gently, pushed her back down and brought the food to her instead. While the cubs ate, Nina and Kyle sat with Lunara near the cave entrance, and they talked about many things, including how long Nina and Kyle would be staying on Valdris, and what their research goals were and why they had chosen this particular moon to study. Nina explained that they worked for an organization called the Galactic Conservation Alliance, and their mission was to document ecosystems and protect endangered species, and they had been traveling together for almost 3 years now. Visiting different worlds, Kyle added that Valdris was special because it had very little traffic from other species, which meant the native plants and animals had developed without outside interference, and studying places like this helped them understand how ecosystems worked naturally. Lunara told them about her own travels and how she had found the dragon eggs abandoned in a crashed ship and decided to raise the cubs herself, and Nina listened with fascination and said it was unusual for someone from one species to adopt children from another, but it showed great compassion. Then Kyle asked a question that had been on his mind since they first met, and he wanted to know if Lunara was worried about what would happen when the cubs grew into full adult dragons, because they would eventually become very large and powerful. Lunara smiled and said she had thought about that many times, and her plan was to teach them to hunt and survive on their own, and when they were old enough she would help them find a good territory where they could live freely, and maybe even find mates and start their own families. She explained that dragons were intelligent creatures who understood love and loyalty, and even when they grew up and left her cave, they would still remember who raised them and would come visit sometimes. Nina looked like she might cry when she heard this, and she said it reminded her why she became a conservationist in the first place, because the bond between different species could be so beautiful and meaningful. The conversation was interrupted when Kyle's scanner started beeping with an alert, and he checked the screen and his expression turned serious, and he told Nina they were picking up unauthorized ship signatures in the upper atmosphere. Nina pulled out her own device and confirmed the reading, and explained to Lunara that 3 small ships had just entered orbit around Valdris, and they were not broadcasting proper identification codes, which usually meant smugglers or poachers. Lunara felt cold fear wash over her, because she knew exactly what those ships were probably looking for, and poachers had set traps in her forest, which meant they were hunting for valuable creatures, and 3 dragon cubs would be worth a fortune on the black market. Kyle was already sending a distress signal to the sector patrol, but Nina shook her head and said the nearest patrol ship was at least 2 days away, and these poachers would land soon and start searching the forest. Lunara stood up and checked her bow and quiver and said she would fight to protect her cubs, but she knew she could not defeat multiple armed poachers alone, and Nina and Kyle looked at each other and seemed to be having a silent conversation. Then Kyle said something that surprised Lunara, and he told her that their research ship had defensive weapons because they sometimes traveled through dangerous areas, and they were authorized to use those weapons to protect endangered species. Nina added that if poachers landed on Valdris and tried to capture the dragons, they could legally engage them under conservation law, and Kyle nodded and said they should move the cubs to their ship where they would be safer. Lunara did not like the idea of leaving her home, but she knew Nina and Kyle were right, because the cave would be the first place poachers would search once they picked up the cubs' thermal signatures, and the human ship had shields and weapons. She quickly gathered her most important belongings into a pack and then picked up Ember, while Frost and Shadow followed, and the whole group moved through the forest as fast as they could without jostling. Ember's injured leg, when they reached the clearing where the human ship was parked, Kyle ran ahead to start the defensive systems, while Nina helped Lunara get the cubs inside. And as soon as everyone was aboard, the ship's ramp closed and locked. Kyle sat at the control console and pulled up a display showing 3 poacher ships descending toward the surface, and Nina stood beside him, watching the screen, and Lunara held her cubs close and hoped that the humans would be able to protect them. The poacher ships landed about 2 miles north of their position, and Kyle enhanced the image to show 6 figures in combat armor, climbing out and spreading into the forest, with weapons and scanning equipment. Nina activated the ship's communication system and broadcast a warning on all frequencies stating that this area was under protection of the Galactic Conservation Alliance, and any attempt to capture or harm protected species would be met with defensive force. The response came back quickly, and it was a rough voice saying they had legal salvage rights to any unregistered creatures, and the humans should mind their own business. Kyle looked at Nina and said that salvage rights were fake, and these were definitely illegal poachers, and Nina agreed and told him to target their ships with warning shots. The human research vessel, which looked small and harmless, suddenly revealed hidden weapon ports and fired 3 precise energy blasts that hit the ground right in front of the poacher ships, and the message was clear without being lethal. Lunara watched through the window as the poachers scrambled back toward their ships, and one of them tried to return fire, but Kyle's shields absorbed the blast easily, and he fired another warning shot that was even closer. The poachers decided it was not worth the fight, and they retreated to their ships and took off fast, leaving the atmosphere within minutes, and Kyle tracked them until they jumped to hyperspace. Nina let out a long breath and said that was closer than she liked. But at least no one got hurt and the cubs were safe, and Lunara hugged all 3 dragons and thanked the humans for protecting her family. After the poachers left Lunara, and the cubs stayed on the human ship for 3 more days while Kyle monitored the sector to make sure the criminals did not return, and Nina continued treating Ember's leg, which was healing faster than expected. During those days, Lunara learned more about humans than she had in all her 300 years of life. And most of what she learned surprised her in good ways, because Nina and Kyle were nothing like the stories other elves told about the aggressive, curious species from Earth. Kyle spent hours teaching Frost and Shadow how to play human games using a holographic display, and the 2 cubs loved chasing the light patterns he created and trying to catch them with their claws. And Lunara noticed that Kyle was always gentle and patient even when the cubs accidentally scratched his hands. Nina showed Lunara her collection of photographs from all the worlds she had visited and explained the conservation work they had done on each planet, and there were pictures of rescued animals and restored habitats and communities that had learned to live in balance with nature. One evening while the cubs were sleeping, Nina made tea using herbs from her supplies, and she and Lunara sat together watching the stars through the viewing window, and Nina asked questions about elf culture and history, and Lunara found herself sharing stories she had not told anyone in decades. She talked about growing up in the great forest cities of her homeworld and learning archery from her mother and spending years studying the old songs that could make plants grow faster and heal sickness. And then she talked about why she left. The truth was that Lunara had always felt different from other elves because they valued tradition and staying in one place. But she wanted to see new worlds and meet new species and experience everything the galaxy had to offer. And eventually her family stopped understanding her restless spirit. Nina listened without judgment, and then shared her own story about growing up on Earth in a city where she never saw wild animals, except in zoos, and how that made her determined to protect the creatures that still lived free. And that was why she joined the Conservation Alliance. Kyle added his own story about being a farm kid who loved studying insects and plants and how his family thought he was strange for caring more about bugs than crops. But he kept following his passion, and eventually it led him to exploring alien ecosystems. Lunara realized that all 3 of them were outsiders in their own ways, and maybe that was why they had connected so easily, because they understood what it felt like to choose a different path from what others expected. On the 4th day, the sector patrol finally arrived, and it was a small but well-armed ship with 5 officers who wanted to investigate the poacher incident and document what had happened. The patrol captain was a stern woman from a species Lunara did not recognize, and she interviewed everyone separately and examined the sensor logs from Kyle's ship and inspected the disabled traps that were still in storage. After several hours of investigation, the captain announced that Nina and Kyle had acted properly under conservation law, and she was issuing a sector-wide alert about the poacher ships and increasing patrols in this area. She also told Lunara that dragon cubs were now officially registered as protected dependents under her care, which meant anyone who tried to take them would face serious criminal charges, and Lunara felt relief wash over her because her babies finally had legal protection. The patrol ship left that evening and life started to return to normal, and Lunara moved back to her cave with the cubs, and Nina and Kyle promised to visit regularly to check on Ember's progress. 2 weeks passed quickly, and Ember was walking normally again, and even starting to practice short gliding flights from low branches, and Lunara felt proud watching her little dragon regain confidence and strength. Nina and Kyle visited every few days, bringing food supplies and sharing meals with Lunara and the cubs, and slowly the visits became less about medical checks and more about friendship. One afternoon, Kyle brought special equipment to record the sounds the dragons made, and he explained that he wanted to study their communication patterns, and Frost and Shadow thought it was a game and started making all kinds of noises to see his reactions. Nina taught Lunara how to use a portable medical scanner so she could check the cubs' vital signs herself, and she also shared information about dragon nutrition and growth stages that she had researched in the Conservation Alliance database. Lunara showed them secret places in the forest, including a crystal cave that glowed at night and a waterfall that created rainbows in the afternoon sun, and the four of them would sit together in beautiful spots and talk about everything from science to philosophy to the best ways to cook different kinds of meat. The cubs grew bigger and stronger every day, and their personalities became more distinct, and Ember turned out to be the cautious, thoughtful one who liked to watch and learn before trying new things. Frost was bold and playful, always testing her limits and getting into minor trouble like trying to eat things she should not, or climbing too high in trees and getting stuck. Shadow was the gentle one who stayed close to Lunara and seemed to sense emotions in a way the others did not, and when Lunara felt sad or worried, Shadow would curl up against her and purr until she felt better. One evening when Nina and Kyle were visiting for dinner, Lunara asked them how much longer they would be staying on. Valdris and both humans looked uncomfortable, and Nina admitted that their research grant was ending soon, and they would need to move on to their next assignment in about 2 weeks. Lunara felt her chest tighten because she had gotten used to having them around, and the cubs loved their visits, and she realized with surprise that she would genuinely miss these humans when they left. Kyle must have seen the sadness on her face because he quickly added that they would stay in contact and could visit during their breaks between assignments, and Nina agreed, saying that Valdris was now one of their favorite places, and they would always come back. The cubs sensed something was wrong, and they all gathered around Lunara making worried sounds, and she petted each of them and told them everything would be okay. But inside she wondered if anything would feel the same. After Nina and Kyle left. That night, after the humans returned to their ship, Lunara lay awake thinking about friendship and how strange it was that she had lived for 300 years and traveled to dozens of worlds. But these two humans she had known for less than a month had become more important to her than most beings she had met. She thought about the stories other elves told about humans being dangerous and unpredictable, and how those stories had made her afraid when she first saw Nina and Kyle in the forest. But the truth was that humans were no more dangerous than any other species, and maybe they were actually better than most because they had chosen to help when they could have walked away, and they had protected her family when they could have stayed safe. Lunara decided that when she eventually returned to her homeworld to visit her family, she would tell different stories about humans, and maybe other elves would learn that prejudice and fear were poor guides compared to actual experience. The cubs shifted in their sleep, pressing closer to her for warmth, and Lunara wrapped her arms around them and closed her eyes and dreamed of silver trees and human friends in a future where different species chose kindness over suspicion. The last 2 weeks before Nina and Kyle had to leave passed too quickly, and Lunara tried to memorize every moment they spent together because she did not know when she would see them again, and the cubs seemed to sense that something was ending on. The final evening, Nina and Kyle brought gifts for everyone, and for Lunara they had compiled a complete medical guide for dragon care, with everything from treating injuries to recognizing signs of illness, and it was loaded onto a datapad that worked without needing network connection. For the cubs they brought toys and treats and a special recording device that could capture messages, so Lunara could send them updates about how the dragons were growing and what new things they learned. They sat together outside the cave watching the double sunset that made Valdris sky turn purple and gold. And no one talked much because words felt inadequate for what they were all feeling. Finally, Nina broke the silence and told Lunara that meeting, her and the cubs had changed how she thought about her work, because before this she had focused on protecting species and ecosystems. But now she understood that sometimes conservation was also about protecting families and friendships that crossed species boundaries. Kyle added that he had learned more from watching Lunara raise the cubs than he had from years of academic study, because love and patience were better teachers than any textbook, and he would carry those lessons into all his future work. Lunara felt tears on her face, and she was not ashamed because elves believed that tears were sacred and should only be shed for things that truly mattered. And these humans and this friendship truly mattered to her. She told them that they had given her something she did not know she was missing, which was proof that the galaxy was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than even 300 years of travel had shown her, and that humans were capable of extraordinary kindness when they chose to be. The cubs gathered around all of them, and Ember, who had been so small and hurt when this all started, was now strong enough to climb onto Kyle's lap and purr while he scratched her scales, and Frost and Shadow curled up against Nina, making sleepy chirping sounds. They stayed like that until the stars came out, and then Nina and Kyle reluctantly said they needed to go back to their ship to prepare for departure in the morning, and there were more hugs and promises to stay in touch, and then they walked away into the forest. The next morning, Lunara took the cubs to watch the human ship lift off, and they stood in the clearing, where so much had happened, and watched the vessel rise into the sky, trailing fire. And then it was gone, and the forest felt very quiet. For several days after that, Lunara felt sad, and the cubs were subdued too, because they missed their human friends, and the cave seemed too empty, even though nothing had actually changed except the absence of visitors. But then one evening the communication device beeped, and it was a message from Nina saying they had arrived safely at their next assignment, and attached was a video of Kyle making funny faces and both of them waving and saying they missed everyone. Lunara recorded a message back showing the cubs and updating Nina on Ember's flying progress and telling them about the new game Frost had invented, and suddenly the distance did not feel quite so large. Over the following months, the messages continued back and forth, and Lunara learned about the new world Nina and Kyle were exploring. And they learned about the cubs' rapid growth and development, and it felt like the friendship was continuing, just in a different form. 6 months after they left, Nina sent an urgent message saying she had discovered something important and needed to talk to Lunara immediately. And when Lunara called back, Nina explained that she had found records of a dragon colony living on a protected world 3 sectors away. The colony had about 40 adult dragons, and they welcomed orphaned cubs and taught them traditional dragon ways. And Nina thought that when Ember, Frost, and Shadow were old enough, they might want to meet others of their kind. Lunara felt mixed emotions about this because part of her wanted to keep the cubs with her forever, but another part knew that they deserved to know their heritage and have the choice to live among dragons if they wanted. She thanked Nina for the information and promised to think about it. And over the next week she observed her cubs carefully and noticed how they were becoming too large for the cave, and how they sometimes made sounds that seemed like they were calling for others of their kind. When the cubs were almost a year old, Lunara decided it was time to at least visit the dragon colony and see if it might be a good place for them eventually, and she sent a message to Nina asking for the coordinates. Nina responded immediately, saying she and Kyle were due for a break from their current assignment, and they would love to accompany Lunara and the cubs on the journey because they wanted to see the colony too. 2 weeks later, the human research ship returned to Valdris, and Lunara and the 3 cubs, who were now the size of large horses, boarded the vessel, and they set off together toward the dragon colony. The journey took 5 days, and during that time, Lunara taught the cubs about dragon history as much as she knew. It and Nina and Kyle helped prepare them for meeting others of their kind. When they finally arrived at the protected world and landed near the colony, Lunara felt nervous because she did not know how the adult dragons would react to an elf who had raised their young, or to humans who had helped protect them. But the colony elders turned out to be wise and kind, and they thanked Lunara for saving the cubs' lives and raising them with love. and they welcomed Ember, Frost, and Shadow into the colony as honored members. The cubs were excited and overwhelmed, meeting so many dragons and learning to fly in formation and hunting with the adults and discovering all the things Lunara could not teach them because she was not a dragon herself. Over. The next week, Lunara watched her cubs become more confident and happy than she had ever seen them, and she knew that this was where they needed to be, even though it broke her heart to think about leaving them on the last evening before they planned. To depart, Ember came to Lunara and pressed her great head against the elf woman's chest and made a sound that was part purr and part song. And Lunara understood that the dragon was saying she would never forget who raised her. Frost and Shadow joined them, and the three young dragons surrounded Lunara with their wings, and she stood in that warm, protective space and cried because endings were hard, even when they were right. The colony elders told Lunara she was welcome to visit any time and that the cubs would always be her children no matter how big they grew or how far they flew. And they also extended the welcome to Nina and Kyle, who had proven themselves friends to dragons. When it was finally time to leave, Lunara walked back to the ship with Nina and Kyle, and she did not look back, because she knew if she did, she would not be able to get on board. And the cubs needed to start their new life without her. As the ship lifted off, Kyle asked Lunara what she would do now. And she thought about it for a moment and then smiled and said she would probably find another species that needed help, because the galaxy was full of orphaned creatures and lost souls. Nina laughed and said that sounded exactly like something Lunara would do, and Kyle added that if she ever needed backup, she knew where to find two humans who were pretty good in a crisis. Lunara looked at her friends and felt grateful beyond words because the journey that had started with a wounded cub and a desperate request for help had given her so much more than she expected, including proof that family was not about species or biology, but about who chose to stand beside you when things got hard. And as the ship jumped to hyperspace carrying them toward new adventures, Lunara knew that somewhere on a protected world 3 young dragons were beginning their own story, and they would carry with them the memory of an elf who loved them and 2 humans who protected them, and maybe they would pass those memories on to their own children someday, teaching the next generation that the universe was better when beings chose compassion over fear, and when different species worked together instead of apart, and that was a legacy worth leaving behind.